This is the punishment for slacking off on household chores. Don't even think about taking a day off for something as trivial as a funeral. Grinning maliciously, my son's wife, Michelle, tossed my mother's keepsake into a metal drum. As the keepsake burned and crumbled with crackling sounds inside the drum, I felt as if the ground beneath me was collapsing in despair. At the same time, anger boiled up inside me, making my body tremble. Seeing me like this, Michelle seemed to think I was just downcast and burst out laughing loudly with a mean look on her face. "Do you even know the value of that? Huh?" Caught off guard by my retort, Michelle let out a startled yelp. This time, I made sure to look Michelle in the eye before I spoke. "That's worth $400,000. Michelle's eyes widened in shock. Watching her face turn pale, I was convinced that now was my chance for revenge. "My name is Nancy. I'm a 72-year-old homemaker. It's been nearly 40 years since I married Tim. My parents, worried about me never getting married, arranged a meeting with Tim, and that's how we met. Tim is a very gentle man, and contrary to my fears, there were no conflicts with his family, leading to a very smooth marriage. Our relationship has been good. It took a while for us to have children, but fortunately, we never felt pressured by those around us. Or rather, I later realized that Tim had been shielding me from the nagging relatives all that time. Knowing this made me fall in love with him even more. Our son, Simon, was born in the 4th year of our marriage. Tim was overjoyed and cried, actively participating in parenting. I still remember thinking how glad I was to have married him. Now, Simon is 36 years old. He's working hard as the next president of Tim's company. And got married 3 years ago. Michelle, Simon's wife, is a bit headstrong. She insisted on not living together when we first met, so they live in a separate house on our property. Becoming a homemaker after marriage, she would go out every day, returning with bags from high-end stores. Although I had my concerns, Tim told me that since Simon and Michelle were a separate household, we shouldn't be too nosy, so I watched over them. One day, Simon mentioned he wanted to live together, saying Michelle found the house too big to manage alone and thought living together would be better. My mother lives with us. 5 years ago, after my father passed away, Tim suggested bringing my mother to live with us. My mother, who has difficulty walking and uses a wheelchair, needs assistance. We have a helper during the day, but I mainly take care of her at night. If Simon and Michelle were to live with us, the household chores would be halved, and I thought it would be a bit easier for me. I readily agreed to live together. And Tim, seeing that I was okay with it, allowed it, so Simon and Michelle began using the previously vacant second floor. We decided to rent out the separate house to prevent it from deteriorating without an occupant. And so, the cohabitation of our family, my mother, and Simon and Michelle began. Michelle initially helped with the household chores and caregiving, but as Simon's work became busier and he started coming home late, she began making excuses to avoid helping. Instead, she even started leaving their laundry for me to do, increasing my burden. A month in, Michelle stopped helping altogether and instead began ordering me around to do this and that. If I talked back, she would complain of being ill or accuse me of bullying her, and I would end up doing the chores in defeat. Worse, when Simon was home, Michelle pretended to be busy with household chores. It became a daily occurrence for her to report to Simon that she had done the chores I had actually done when Tim and Simon were out. At times, it was as if she was portraying me as not doing any chores and pushing them onto her. In reality, it was the complete opposite. Michelle would go out as soon as Tim and Simon left for work and return just before they came home at night, acting as if she had been too busy working at home to even have time for makeup. Simon, being quite under his wife's thumb, would never suspect that Michelle was going out every day in his absence. Listening to my eldest son's wife always brings a smile to my face. She says, "It's great that you're getting some relief, Mom." I couldn't help but be moved by my son's thoughtful words every time. One day, I had to go out for a doctor's appointment and couldn't arrange for a caregiver, so I asked my son's wife, Michelle, to help out. She unusually agreed to help just for the morning, After I explained it would only take about 2 hours, so I thanked her and left. However, when I returned, Michelle was nowhere to be found. Rushing to my mother's side, I found her asleep, seemingly undisturbed by my absence, which relieved me. Michelle casually returned in the evening. Unable to hold back, I confronted her. "Michelle, I specifically asked you to help out just for this morning, right? It's good nothing happened to Mom, but why did you leave?" Michelle frowned at my words. Not even trying to hide her annoyance while twirling her long hair, she retorted. "Well, she was just sleeping, right? You were coming back soon anyway, so I thought I wasn't needed. Besides, I'm busy too. I wanted to get my nails done." "Really?" I was infuriated by her selfishness. But seeing my anger, Michelle just smirked and said, "Are you mad? That's fine. I'll just tell Simon you're bullying me." Michelle's triumphant look was unbearable. But I wasn't strong enough to retort. I had no choice but to silently endure her behavior. After this incident, Michelle became even more unbearable. Then, one day, Simon, who had taken a rare day off, approached me with a serious look. "Mom, I heard from Michelle. Are you really bullying her?" "Me? No way, I would never do such a thing." Although I answered immediately, Simon seemed unconvinced. Reluctantly agreeing to sit down and talk, Simon finally joined me at the table. "So, Michelle told you that I've been bullying her?" I inquired. "Yes. I know you're not the type to do such things, but Michelle was crying. If it's true, I have to support my wife. Dad always said to put your wife first after marriage." That's exactly what Tim had always said. To prioritize the wife over everyone else, and to trust her first and foremost. While I was glad Simon had grown into such a considerate person, I was also furious at Michelle for deceiving him. "Is there any proof that I've been bullying her?" "No, just what Michelle told me." I sighed, knowing it would come to this. "Of course, there's no evidence. Just like Michelle doesn't have proof that I bullied her, I don't have proof that I didn't." "I see." Simon nodded, before standing up and leaving, hinting he might want to talk about this again. That night, I told Tim everything that had happened. After sharing Michelle's recent actions, Tim thought for a moment before making a phone call. He then asked me to keep track of the times Michelle went out. Starting the next day, I followed Tim's instructions and began logging Michelle's outings. Additionally, Tim secretly installed surveillance cameras to gather evidence of her outings. Michelle continued her routine of leaving the house as soon as Tim and Simon went to work. Gradually, she began referring to me as the maid. I was seething with anger but held back as Tim advised patience. Without a word of complaint, I continued to obey, even as Michelle began ordering me to clean their living area. While doing laundry, I stumbled upon shocking evidence. "Can't believe this!" I took photos, carefully replaced everything, and began compiling evidence to eventually confront Simon. Just as we were planning to discuss everything with Simon on his next day off, my mother fell critically ill and was rushed to the hospital. We tried calling Michelle, who was notoriously hard to wake once asleep, but couldn't reach her. Simon had always mentioned how difficult it was to wake Michelle, but Tim and I knew the real reason she wouldn't answer. Thanks to the doctor's efforts, my mother held on until morning but passed away before noon. I cried uncontrollably, and Tim comforted me throughout. "Michelle got in touch. She's waiting at home," Simon said as he returned to the hospital room and held my mother's hand, crying. After discussing arrangements, we went back home to meet Michelle. "What's that?" Tim asked as he noticed smoke coming from our yard while driving. "Is this a fire at a time like this?" Panicked, I rushed inside alone, only to find Michelle, my son's wife, throwing things into a drum can in the yard. "What are you doing?" She turned around at my voice. In her right hand was a can of beer, and in her left, something familiar that made my blood run cold. "What are you planning to do with that?" It was an old book, a keepsake from my mother. She had collected them as a hobby, dedicating one wall of her room to a bookshelf where they were stored. Next to Michelle, a pile of old books was haphazardly stacked. Michelle, clearly drunk and in high spirits, said, "Well, Grandma's gone now, so we're not using that room, right? So, I'm cleaning it up for you. I'm taking that room." As she said this, she threw the books into the drum can, one after another. I was so shocked I couldn't move, barely managing to utter a weak stop. "First of all, for a servant, you didn't prepare breakfast, the bath wasn't ready, and the laundry wasn't done. Can't believe you slacked off housework just because Grandma was at her peak." I was really troubled. "Apologize to me." "Okay, I'm sorry, please, those books are important. Don't burn them." Protecting my mother's books was my top priority. I repeated insincere apologies while begging Michelle to stop. However, Michelle looked at me satisfied and burned another book. "This is what you get for slacking off on housework for something like a funeral." Grinning, Michelle continued to throw my mother's keepsakes into the drum can. Watching the keepsakes burn and crumble inside the can, I felt a crushing sense of despair and my body trembled with a bubbling anger. Seeing me like this, Michelle, thinking I was just down, laughed out loud with a nasty look on her face. "Do you know the value of those?" "What?" Not expecting me to talk back, Michelle exclaimed in a flustered voice. This time, I locked eyes with Michelle and spoke clearly. "That's worth $400,000. Michelle's eyes widened in shock. Seeing her face turn pale, I knew now was my chance for revenge. "Hey! What are you doing?" My husband and Simon, having followed me, restrained a stunned Michelle and doused the drum can with water. About half of the old books were saved, but it seemed most had turned to ash in the can, and my husband shook his head at me. Unable to move from the shock, my husband led me back to our room. "Wait here for a bit," he said, returning with the remaining old books from the garden. "Simon is talking to Michelle right now, so you'll be called soon. Are you okay? I know you're not, so don't push yourself. I'll be your side." My husband reassured me, making me cry again. Shortly after, there was a knock at the door, and Simon entered the room. The stress of his grandmother's passing and his wife's bizarre behavior had taken its toll on him. Michelle was apparently in the living room. "Mom, I'm really sorry. I talked to Michelle, but what she's saying is all over the place. Let's talk with everyone. Can we call a lawyer, please?" "All right," my husband replied. Contacting a lawyer who would arrive in about 15 minutes, so we decided to start the discussion. Moving to the living room, Michelle glared at me without hiding her displeasure. Simon tried to calm her, but she burst into tears, screaming, "You always take your parents' side." The discussion seemed impossible with her attitude. However, my husband began calmly. "Let's hear your reasoning for this." "Your mom said before. Those books are in the way, so once Grandma's gone, you can throw them away. Why are you getting mad now?" Michelle cried out her defense, to which my husband looked exasperated. When she realized her crying tactic wasn't working, Michelle stopped and began a different claim. "I was always mistreated by your mom, just wanted to get back at her." "Oh? And what kind of mistreatment did my wife do?" Challenged by my husband's calm inquiry, Michelle hesitated for a moment but then started listing accusations against me. "Being forced to do all the housework, receiving snide remarks whenever I wanted to go out. And I was the one doing most of the caregiving. And I wasn't even allowed to be there for Grandma's last moment. I got a message saying don't come." I was almost impressed by how she could pile on so many lies. My husband was nodding along as he listened, but as soon as Michelle finished speaking, he laid out some documents on the table. These were detailed records of the antique books, each with its price listed. "What's this?" "I hadn't mentioned it before because you seemed uninterested in books, but those antiques are extremely valuable. My wife and I spent years collecting them for Nancy's mother. There's no way she would have said it's okay to dispose of them. The total collection is worth about $800,000, and you've burned about half, so that's at least $400,000. Can you afford to pay that? Michelle turned pale upon hearing this. She obviously hadn't taken my words seriously. Unable to believe that those old, brown books could be worth so much. Well, Dad, Mom, I'm so sorry. We should have just enough in our savings. Not that it makes it okay. Besides Simon, Michelle's face went from pale to white. Simon might have seen it as remorse, but my husband and I sensed something else. Michelle, you've been dipping into the savings, haven't you? There's none left, right? How do you know that? Caught red-handed, Michelle let the truth slip. Simon was shocked, staring at her in disbelief. The reason we knew? The lawyer had brought additional documents. I figured as much. You've been accusing me of bullying you to Simon, but in reality, you were the bully. Calling me a servant and dumping all the housework on me. Look at this. It's a record of all the times you went out. Simon trembled as he read through the evidence. His trust in his wife shattered. Meanwhile, Michelle tried to dismiss the documents as fabrications. Seems like you have quite a lot of free time on your hands. Making up such fake documents is just awful. Really? Then how do you explain these security camera footage? I pointed out, leaving her no room to argue. Michelle turned to Simon, pleading in a sweet, remorseful tone. Simon, I'm sorry. I was just lonely without you. I went out to see friends and shop. I won't do it again. Please forgive me. Friends, huh? My husband remarked skeptically. And Michelle realized we knew her deepest secret. Panicking, she tried to wrap up the conversation. Anyway, I'm really sorry for everything. I'll get a job and pay back the $400,000, okay? This is over now, right, Simon? Simon, confused by her haste, didn't know what to make of it. But seizing the moment, the lawyer and we laid out irrefutable evidence on the table. What's this, Michelle? Simon demanded, his voice rising. Michelle desperately tried to convince Simon that it was all a misunderstanding, attempting to divert his attention away from the documents. However, Simon brushed her aside and proceeded to scrutinize the papers. The documents revealed Michelle's affair with her ex-boyfriend from school days. In fact, investigations showed she never broke up with him. He was unemployed, living in a hotel on Michelle's dime. Seeing Simon as nothing but a cash cow. So, you've been betraying me from the start. It's not true. It's all made up. I love you, believe me. Michelle desperately tried to convince him, but we were beyond disgusted. These documents are from a detective I hired. They're reliable, Simon said, as Michelle slumped to the floor in defeat. Simon, unable to bear staying any longer, started to leave. Michelle, in a last-ditch effort, called out to him. Hey, Simon! Hang on! I don't want to see your face again. We'll go through lawyers from now on. As Simon left, Michelle reached out to him in vain. My husband and I left the matter to the lawyer and consoled our disheartened son, discussing what would come next. Soon after, Simon had Michelle evicted, leading to a scene and her eventual arrest. A restraining order was issued, and legal actions were taken against her and her lover. They demanded compensation for the money spent during hotel stays, on top of the usual damages. Surprisingly, Michelle's lover, who had other sugar daddies, paid the entire amount in one go. Rumor has it that because of this, another of his benefactors found out about the affair with Michelle, and now he's been forced into non-stop physical labor until he earns back what he paid to Simon. After being dumped by her lover, Michelle has been juggling part-time jobs to pay Simon and me the ordered alimony. Though we receive a set amount each month, it will likely take longer than it takes a child to reach adulthood to fully settle the debt. My husband retired, passing the company to Simon to bolster his spirits. Perhaps there are things that men can understand among themselves. Simon has been dedicating himself to his work and, bit by bit, seems to be regaining his spirits. Later, when Michelle tried to reconcile, Simon refused her outright, maintaining the restraining order. However, Simon firmly refused her. Without even seeing her face, he reportedly responded over the intercom, "You know there's a restraining order, right? I'll call the police." Eventually, Michelle was escorted out by the security guards. We fulfilled our dream of building a home in the countryside and converting our old house into a popular share house, securing a comfortable retirement. With Simon moving to a different apartment, we decided to renovate our original home into a trendy shared house. Thanks to its prime location, we were immediately flooded with applicants. Between this passive income and our savings, it looks like we won't have to worry about money in our retirement. 3 years post-divorce, Simon mentioned a woman he'd like us to meet. A coworker who had been by his side. My husband approved, saying she was trustworthy. We looked forward to their visit, hopeful for Simon's new chapter.